It's been 20 years since the establishment of the African Peer Review Mechanism. The voluntary initiative is an institution of the African Union, acceded to by member states, well, some member states. We're now joined by Stephen Gruzd, head of the African Governance and Diplomacy Program at the South African Institute of International Affairs. Thank you very much for your patience with us, Mr. Gruzd, this afternoon. Let's start with the concept of the African Peer Review Mechanism and how it came to be from the fathers of African Renaissance.
Hi, good afternoon. Thanks for having me. Can you hear me?
Loud and clear, sir.
Okay. So this mechanism arose in the early 2000s, spurred on by people like President Thabo Mbeki and President Olusegun Obasanjo from Nigeria. It was around the time of the Millennium Development Goals. It was when Africa was seeking to put its house in order. The reforms that went to change the Organization of African Unity into the African Union were being put into effect. And the APRM was established as a way to encourage and measure good governance across the continent, encouraging countries to sign and ratify various protocols and standards and codes, examine themselves and their own governance, subject themselves to scrutiny by their peers, and eventually implement the program of action that came out at the end of this long process.
Of the 43 APRM member states, just how many have opened themselves up to scrutiny from their peers?
So I think the number is 26 of them have been reviewed. There are a number of countries that have been reviewed twice, including Mozambique and South Africa. But many other countries that are members, like Malawi and Angola, for example, signed up, both of them, in 2004, and the process hasn't happened at national level yet. So there is a waning commitment by some members, but the APRM has also been attracting new members over the last 6 or 7 years. Countries like Botswana, Zimbabwe, Namibia, all of which were quite skeptical about the APRM, have acceded and been active in their processes, not so much Zimbabwe, but the other countries.
Mr. Gruzd, how would you characterize governance on the continent? And very cognizant that the continent is not a country, we've got over 50 states, but how would you characterize governance in trying to measure the impact that the APRM has had? Granted, not everybody is a member, but what would you say about governance in Africa?
Yes, you're right. We have a very diverse continent with large states, small states, island states, all with varying levels of governance. I think the disappointment for me after 20 years of the APRM is that it's not dramatically shifted governance significantly. Yes, countries are members and they're adhering and they're doing reports and so on. But if you look at something like the Ibrahim Index of African Governance, the scores for APRM countries have not dramatically changed. So I think, unfortunately, big reports are produced, lots of recommendations are made, but at the end of the day, it's up to the government, and many governments have simply ignored those recommendations that they didn't want to put into practice, and the central organs of the APRM have no way to censure or even monitor the implementation of programs of action.
Maybe we can whittle it down and take a look at the West African nation of Ghana. It was the first to be reviewed back in 2006. And you take a look at 2023, how do you measure the success of the APRM? Just looking at this one example, perhaps.
Yeah, it's quite difficult to measure impact. My sense is, and I just actually returned from Ghana last week, my sense is that the process has disappeared a little bit. When it was first reviewed, it was under President John Kufuor, who was quite a reformer, and the APRM suited his domestic agenda. Since then, and there was a very dynamic secretariat and National Governing Council, and Ghana was really leading the way. As his party lost power and other parties have come into power, there's been less and less enthusiasm for the APRM, and it's quite difficult to pinpoint what it has achieved. So one of the recommendations that was made in Ghana was that the cabinet was too big and they were paying too many ministers. So they shrunk the size of the cabinet, and then when a new government came in, they expanded the size of the cabinet again. It said they should pass certain laws. It did indeed result in the Freedom of Information Act being passed in Ghana. But, yeah, it's not easy to measure this in quantitative terms.
Sure. Is it perhaps easier to, and I don't even know if this is a fair question to ask, so if you take a look at the money that is being pumped into the APRM versus the output, help us understand, how much does it take to keep this organization running? Is it worth it? Is that a fair question?
Yeah, it is a fair question. I mean, I think the amount is probably slightly over $50 billion to keep the APRM afloat for the last 20 years. You do have to ask the question of outputs compared to inputs, and that's a lot of money that could have gone to other things. Having said that, do we need a tool to help us measure governance and implement good governance? Yes, I think we do. So I think it serves a very important purpose. The end results, though, have been a little bit disappointing.
What would help, and also what is good governance, right? What that concept, good governance, what is it? What would help in terms of governance on the continent if you take a look at what has been termed the coup belt of West Africa? You take a look at the Southern African region where there is allegedly no coherence. You take a look at the East African bloc. Some suggest, well, there's work that is being done there, but there's also instability in some parts. Let's not even talk about Central or North Africa. And so what would help when it comes to this concept of good governance or just governance in Africa?
Well, I think governance is adhering to the nation's laws and customs and codes of conduct and doing things in a fair, equitable, transparent and accountable way. Yes, I mean, the different regions of the continent are experiencing problems. I think West Africa is indeed, as you said, undergoing coups. There have been many in the last 5 years, and many of those countries have gone through the APRM, so it doesn't seem to have made much difference there. There are regional variations. We've got the insurgency in Mozambique, which is destabilizing the SADC region. So I think countries must commit themselves to doing what's right and doing what is for the benefit of their people, to minimize corruption, and to make sure the rule of law is carried out.
Stephen Gruzd, thank you so much for your contribution this afternoon, head of the African Governance and Diplomacy Program at the South African Institute of International Affairs.